1Q84 by Haruki Murakami. Book 1, Chapter 20. Tango. The Poor Gilyaks. Tango couldn't sleep. Fuka-eri was in his bed, wearing his pajamas, sound asleep. Tango had made simple preparations for sleeping on the couch, no great imposition, since he often napped there. But he had felt not the slightest bit sleepy when he lay down, so he was writing his long novel at the kitchen table. The word processor was in the bedroom. He was using a ballpoint pen on a writing pad. This, too, was no great imposition. The word processor was undeniably more convenient for writing speed and for saving documents, but he loved the classic art of writing characters by hand on paper. Writing fiction at night was rather rare for Tango. He enjoyed working when it was light outside and people were walking around. Sometimes, when he was writing at night, while everything was hushed and wrapped in darkness, the style he produced would be a little too heavy, and he would have to rewrite the whole passage in the light of day. Rather than go to that trouble, it was better to write in daylight from the outset. Writing at night for the first time in ages, though, using a ballpoint pen and paper, Tango found his mind working smoothly. His imagination stretched its limbs and the story flowed freely. One idea would link naturally with the next, almost without interruption. The tip of the pen raising a persistent scrape against the white paper. Whenever his hand tired, he would set the pen down and move the fingers of his right hand in the air, like a pianist doing imaginary scales. The hands of the clock were nearing 1:30. He heard strangely few sounds from the outside, as though extraneous noises were being soaked up by the clouds covering the city's sky like a thick cotton layer. He picked up his pen again and was still arranging words on paper when suddenly he remembered. Tomorrow was the day his older girlfriend would be coming. She always showed up around 11 o'clock on Friday mornings. He would have to get rid of fuka-eri before then. Thank goodness she wore no perfume or cologne. His girlfriend would be sure to notice right away if the bed had someone else's smell. Tango knew how observant and jealous she could be. It was fine for her to have sex with her husband now and then, but she became seriously angry if Tango went out with another woman. Married sex is something else, she explained. It's charged to a separate account. A separate account? Under a whole different heading. You mean you use a different part of your feelings? That's it. Even if I use the same body parts, I make a distinction in the feelings I use, so it really doesn't matter. I have the ability to do that as a mature woman, but you're not allowed to sleep with other girls and stuff. I'm not doing that, Tango said. Even if you're not having sex with another girl, I would feel slighted just to think such a possibility exists. Just to think such a possibility exists, Tango asked, amazed. You don't understand a woman's feelings, do you? And you call yourself a novelist. This seems awfully unfair to me. It may be unfair, but I'll make it up to you, she said. And she did. Tango was satisfied with this relationship with his older girlfriend. She was no beauty, at least in the general sense. Her facial features were, if anything, rather unusual. Some might even find her ugly, but Tango had liked her looks from the start, and as a sexual partner, she was beyond reproach. Her demands on him were few: to meet her once a week, for 3 or 4 hours, to participate in attentive sex, twice if possible, and to keep away from other women. Basically, that was all she asked of him. Home and family were very important to her, and she had no intention of destroying them for Tango. She simply did not have a satisfying sex life with her husband. Her interests and Tango's were a perfect fit. Tango had no particular desire for other women. What he wanted most of all was uninterrupted free time. If he could have sex on a regular basis, he had nothing more to ask of a woman. He did not welcome the unavoidable responsibility that came with dating a woman his own age, falling in love, and having a sexual relationship. The psychological stages through which one had to pass, the hints regarding various possibilities, the unavoidable collisions of expectations. Tango hoped to get by without taking on such burdens. The concept of duty always made Tango cringe. He had lived his life thus far skillfully avoiding any position that entailed responsibility, and to do so he was prepared to endure most forms of deprivation. In order to flee from responsibility, Tango learned early on in life to make himself inconspicuous. He worked hard to negate his presence by publicly displaying very little of his true abilities, by keeping his opinions to himself, and by avoiding situations that put him at the center of attention. He had to survive on his own, without depending on others, from the time he was a child. But children have no real power, and so, whenever a strong wind began to blow, he would have to take shelter and grab onto something to prevent himself from being blown away. It was necessary for him to keep such contrivances in mind at all times, like the orphans in Dickens' novels. But while it could be said that things had gone well for Tango so far, several tears had begun to appear in the fabric of his tranquil life since he first laid his hands on the manuscript of fuka-eri's Air Crystallis. First of all, he had been dragged almost bodily into Komatsu's dangerous plan. Secondly, the beautiful girl who wrote the book had shaken his heart from a strange angle, and it seemed that the experience of rewriting Air Crystallis had begun to change something inside of him. Now, Tango felt driven by a powerful urge to write his own novel. This, of course, was a change for the better, but it was also true that his neat, self-satisfied lifestyle was being tested. In any case, tomorrow was Friday. His girlfriend would be coming. He had to get rid of fuka-eri before then. Fuka-eri woke up just after 2 o'clock in the morning. Dressed in his pajamas, she opened the bedroom door and came out to the kitchen. She drank a big glass of water and, rubbing her eyes, sat down at the kitchen table across from Tango. "Am I in your way?" Fuka-eri asked in her usual style, free of question marks. "Not especially," Tango said. "I don't mind." "What are you writing?" Tango closed the pad and set his ballpoint pen down. "Nothing much," Tango said. "Anyway, I was just thinking of quitting." "Mind if I stay up with you a while?" she asked. "Not at all," I'm going to have a little wine. Want some? The girl shook her head. I want to stay out here a while. That's fine. I'm not sleepy either. Tango's pajamas were too big on fuka-eri. She had the sleeves and cuffs rolled up. Whenever she leaned forward, the collar revealed glimpses of the swell of her breasts. The sight of fuka-eri wearing his pajamas made it strangely difficult for Tango to breathe. He opened the refrigerator and poured the wine left in the bottom of a bottle into a glass. Hungry? Tango asked. On their way back to his apartment earlier, they had had some spaghetti at a small restaurant near Koenji Station. The portions had not been very big, and several hours had elapsed in the meantime. I can make you a sandwich, or something else simple, if you'd like. I'm not hungry. I'd rather have you read me what you wrote. You mean what I was writing just now? Uh-huh. Tango picked up his pen and twirled it between his fingers. It looked ridiculously small in his big hand. I make it a policy not to show people manuscripts until they're finished and revised. I don't want to jinx my writing. Jinx? It's an English word. To cause bad luck. It's a kind of rule of mine. Fuka-eri looked at Tango for several moments. Then she drew the pajama collar closed. So, read me a book. You can get to sleep if someone reads you a book. Uh-huh. I suppose Professor Ebisuno has read you lots of books. Because he stays up all night. Did he read you The Tale of the Heike? Fuka-eri shook her head. I listened to a tape. So that's how you memorized it. Must have been a very long tape. Fuka-eri used two hands to suggest a pile of cassette tapes. Very long. What part did you recite at the press conference? General Yoshitsune's flight from the capital. That's the part after the defeat of the Heike, where the victorious Genji general Yoshitsune flees from Kyoto, with his brother Yoritomo in pursuit. The Genji have won the war against the Heike, but then the family starts fighting amongst themselves. Right. What other sections can you recite from memory? Tell me what you want to hear. Tango tried to recall some episodes from the Tale of the Heike. It was a long book with an endless number of stories. Off the top of his head, Tango named the Battle of Dan-no-ura. Fuka-eri took some 20 seconds to collect her thoughts in silence. Then she began to chant a decisive part of the final sea battle in the original verse. The Genji warriors had boarded the Heike ships to find the sailors and the helmsmen pierced by arrows or slashed by swords, their corpses lying in the bilge, leaving no one to steer. Aboard a small boat, new middle counselor Tomomori approached the imperial ship and said, "And so it seems to have come to this. Heave everything unsightly into the ocean." He ran from stem to stern, sweeping, scrubbing, gathering litter, cleaning everything with his own hands. The ladies in waiting asked, "How goes the battle, counselor?" "Soon you will behold those marvelous men of the East," he replied with caustic laughter. "How dare you jest at a time like this?" the women cried. Observing the state of affairs, the nun of second rank proceeded to carry out the plan upon which she had settled long before. Hooding herself under two dark grey robes, She lifted high the hems of her glossy silk split skirt, tucked the imperial bead strand under one arm, thrust the imperial sword under her sash, and took the child emperor himself in her arms. Mere woman though I am, I shall never fall into enemy hands. I shall go wherever His Majesty goes. All you women whose hearts are with him, follow us without delay. So saying, she strode to the gunwale. His Majesty had turned but 8 that year, yet he exhibited a maturity far beyond his age. His handsome countenance radiated an imperial glow, and his glossy black hair could cascade down his back past the waist. Confused by all the commotion, he asked, "Grandmother, where are you taking me?" She turned to the innocent young sovereign and, fighting back her tears, she said, "Do you not know yet what is happening? For having followed the 10 precepts in your previous life, you were born to be a lord commanding 10,000 charioteers. But now, dragged down by an evil karma, your good fortune has exhausted itself. Turn first now to the east, and say your farewell to the grand shrine of Ise. Then turn toward the west and call upon Amida Buddha. That is, heavenly hosts may guide you to the western Pure Land. This country is no better than a scattering of millet, a place where hearts know only sadness. I am taking you therefore to a wonderful Pure Land called Paradise." Her tears escaped as she spoke thus to him. His Majesty wore a robe of olive-tinged grey, and his hair was bound on either side in boyish loops. Tears streaming from his eyes, he joined his darling hands. First he bowed toward the east and spoke his farewell to the grand shrine of Ise. Then he turned to the west, and once he had called upon Amida Buddha, the nun of 2nd rank clasped him to her breast, and comforting him with the words, "There is another capital beneath the waves," she plunged 10,000 fathoms beneath the sea. Listening to her recite the story with his eyes closed, Tango felt as though he were hearing it the traditional way, chanted by a blind priest accompanying himself on the lute, and he was reminded anew that the tale of the Heike was a narrative poem handed down through an oral tradition. Fuka-eri's normal style of speaking was extremely flat, lacking almost all accent and intonation. But when she launched into the tale, her voice became startlingly strong, rich and colourful, as if something had taken possession of her. The magnificent sea battle fought in 1185 on the swirling currents between Honshu and Kyushu came vividly to life. The Heike side was doomed to defeat, and Kiyomori's wife, Tokiko, the nun of 2nd rank, plunged into the waves, holding her grandson, the child emperor Antoku, in her arms. Her ladies-in-waiting followed her in death rather than fall into the hands of the rough eastern warriors. Tomomori, concealing his grief, jokingly urged the ladies to kill themselves. "You'll have nothing but a living hell if you go on like this," he had told them. "You had best end your lives here and now." "Want me to go on?" Fuka-eri asked. "No, that's fine. Thank you," Tango answered, stunned. He understood how those news reporters, at a loss for words, must have felt. How did you manage to memorize such a long passage? Listening to the tape over and over. Listening to the tape over and over. An ordinary person still wouldn't be able to memorize it. It suddenly dawned on Tango that precisely to the degree she could not read a book, the girl's ability to memorize what she had heard might be extraordinarily well developed. Just as certain children with savant syndrome can absorb and remember huge amounts of visual information in a split second. I want you to read me a book, fuka-eri said. What kind of book would you like? Do you have the book you were talking about with the professor? Fuka-eri asked. The one with Big Brother. 1984. I don't have that one. What kind of story is it? Tango tried to recall the plot. I read it once, a long time ago, in the school library, so I don't remember the details too well. It was published in 1949, when 1984 seemed to be a time far in the future. That's this year. Yes, by coincidence. At some point, the future becomes reality, and then it quickly becomes the past. In his novel, George Orwell depicted the future as a dark society dominated by totalitarianism. People are rigidly controlled by a dictator named Big Brother. Information is restricted, and history is constantly being rewritten. The protagonist works in a government office, and I'm pretty sure his job is to rewrite words. Whenever a new history is written, the old histories all have to be thrown out. In the process, words are remade, and the meanings of current words are changed. What with history being rewritten so often, nobody knows what is true anymore. They lose track of who is an enemy and who an ally. It's that kind of story. They rewrite history. Robbing people of their actual history is the same as robbing them of part of themselves. It's a crime. Fuka-eri thought about that for a moment. Tango went on. Our memory is made up of our individual memories and our collective memories. The two are intimately linked, and history is our collective memory. If our collective memory is taken from us, is rewritten, we lose the ability to sustain our true selves. You rewrite stuff. Tango laughed and took a sip of wine. All I did was touch up your story for the sake of expedience. That's totally different from rewriting history. But that Big Brother book is not here now, she asked. Unfortunately, no, so I can't read it to you. I don't mind another book. Tango went to his bookcase and scanned the spines of his books. He had read many books over the years, but he owned few. He tended to dislike filling his home with a lot of possessions. When he finished a book, unless it was something quite special, he would take it to a used bookstore. He bought only books he knew he was going to read right away, and he would read the ones he cared about very closely, until they were ingrained in his mind. When he needed other books, he would borrow them from the neighborhood library. Choosing a book to read to fuka-eri took Tango a long time. He was not used to reading aloud, and had almost no clue which might be best for that. After a good deal of indecision, he pulled out Anton Chekhov's Sakhalin Island, which he had just finished reading the week before. He had marked the most interesting spots with paper tags, and figured this would make it easy to choose suitable passages to read. Tango prefaced his reading with a brief explanation of the book, that Chekhov was only 30 years old when he traveled to Sakhalin Island in 1890, that no one really knew why the urbane Chekhov, who had been praised as one of the most promising young writers of the generation after Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, and who was living a cosmopolitan life in Moscow, would have made up his mind to go off to live on Sakhalin Island, which was like the end of the earth. Sakhalin had been developed primarily as a penal colony, and to most people it symbolized only bad luck and misery. Furthermore, the Trans-Siberian Railway had not yet been built, which meant that Chekhov had to make more than 2,500 miles of his trip in a horse-drawn cart across frozen earth, an act of self-denial that subjected the young man in poor health to merciless suffering. And finally, when he ended his 8-month-long journey to the Far East and published Sakhalin as the fruit of his labor, the work did little more than bewilder most readers, who found that it more closely resembled a dry, investigative report or gazetteer than a work of literature. People whispered amongst themselves, why did Chekhov do such a wasteful, pointless thing at such an important stage in his literary career? One critic answered scathingly, it was just a publicity stunt. Another view was that Chekhov had gone there looking for a new subject because he had run out of things to write about. Tango showed fuka-eri the location of Sakhalin on the map included in the book. Why did Chekhov go to Sakhalin? Fuka-eri asked. You mean, why do I think he went? Uh-huh. Did you read the book? I sure did. What did you think? Chekhov himself might not have understood exactly why he went, Tango said. Or maybe he didn't really have a reason. He just suddenly felt like going. Say he was looking at the shape of Sakhalin Island on a map, and the desire to go just bubbled up out of nowhere. I've had that kind of experience myself. I'm looking at a map, and I see some place that makes me think, I absolutely have to go to this place, no matter what. And most of the time, for some reason, the place is far away and hard to get to. I feel this overwhelming desire to know what kind of scenery the place has, or what people are doing there. It's like measles. You can't show other people exactly where the passion comes from. It's curiosity in the purest sense, an inexplicable inspiration. Of course, traveling from Moscow to Sakhalin in those days involved almost unimaginable hardships, so I suspect that wasn't Chekhov's only reason for going. Name another one. Well, Chekhov was both a novelist and a doctor. It could be that as a scientist, he wanted to examine something like a diseased part of the vast Russian nation with his own eyes. Chekhov felt uncomfortable living as a literary star in the city. He was fed up with the atmosphere of the literary world, and was put off by the affectations of other writers, who were mainly interested in tripping each other up. He was disgusted by the malicious critics of the day, His journey to Sakhalin may have been an act of pilgrimage designed to cleanse him of such literary impurities. Sakhalin Island overwhelmed him in many ways. I think it was precisely for this reason that Chekhov never wrote a single literary work based on his trip to Sakhalin. It was not the kind of half-baked experience that could be easily made into material for a novel. The diseased part of the country became, so to speak, a physical part of him, which may have been the very thing he was looking for. "Is the book interesting?" Fuka-eri asked. I found it very interesting. It's full of dry figures and statistics and, as I said earlier, not much in the way of literary color. The scientist side of Chekhov is on full display, but that is the very quality of the book that makes me feel I can sense the purity of the decision reached by Anton Chekhov, the individual. Mixed in with the dry records are some very impressive examples of observation of character and scenic description, which is not to say there is anything wrong with the dry passages that relate only facts. Some of them are quite marvelous. For example, the sections on the Gilyaks. "The Gilyaks," Fuka-eri said. The Gilyaks were the indigenous people of Sakhalin long before the Russians arrived to colonize it. They originally lived at the southern end of the island, but they moved up to the center when they were displaced by the Ainu, who moved north from Hokkaido. Of course, the Ainu themselves had also been pushed northward by the Japanese. Chekhov struggled to observe at close hand and to record as accurately as possible the rapidly disappearing Gilyak culture. Tango opened to a passage on the Gilyaks. At some points, he would introduce suitable omissions and changes to the text in order to make it easily understandable to his listener. The Gilyaks is of strong, thick-set build, and average, even small, in height. Tall stature would hamper him in the taiga. That's a Russian forest, Tango added. His bones are thick and are distinctive for the powerful development of all the appendages and protuberances to which the muscles are attached. And this leads one to assume firm, powerful muscles and a constant, strenuous battle with nature. His body is lean and wiry, without a layer of fat. You do not come across obese, plump Gilyaks. Obviously, all the fat is expended in warmth, of which the body of a Sakhalin inhabitant needs to produce such a great deal in order to compensate for the loss engendered by the low temperature and the excessive dampness of the air. It's clear why the Gilyaks consume such a lot of fat in his food. He eats rich seal, salmon, sturgeon, and whale fat, meat and blood, all in large quantities, in a raw, dry, often frozen state. And because he eats coarse, unrefined food, the places to which his masticatory muscles are attached are singularly well developed, and his teeth are heavily worn. His diet is made up exclusively of animal products, and rarely, only when he happens to have his dinner at home or if he eats out at a celebration, will he add Manchurian garlic or berries. According to Nevelskoy's testimony, the Gilyaks consider working the soil a great sin. Anybody who begins to dig the earth or who plants anything will infallibly die. But bread, which they were acquainted with by the Russians, they eat with pleasure, as a delicacy. And it is not a rarity these days in Alexandrovsk, or Rikovo to meet a Gilyak carrying a round loaf under his arm. Tango stopped reading at this point for a short breather. Fuka-eri was listening intently, but he could not read any reaction from her expression. "What do you think? Do you want me to keep reading, or do you want to switch to another book?" he asked. "I want to know more about the Gilyaks." "Okay, I'll keep going." "Is it okay if I get in bed?" Fuka-eri asked. "Sure," Tango said. They moved into the bedroom. Fuka-eri crawled into bed, and Tango brought a chair next to the bed and sat in it. He continued with his reading. The Gilyaks never wash, so that even ethnographers find it difficult to put a name to the real color of their faces. They do not wash their linen, and their fur clothing looks as if it has just been stripped off a dead dog. The Gilyaks themselves give off a heavy, acid smell, and you know you are near their dwellings from the repulsive, sometimes hardly bearable odor of dried fish and rotting fish offal. By each yurt usually lies a drying ground filled to the brim with split fish, which from a distance, especially when the sun is shining on them, look like filaments of coral. Around these drying grounds, Krusenstern saw a vast number of maggots covering the ground to the depth of an inch. Krusenstern. I think he was an early explorer. Chekhov was a very studious person. He had read every book ever written about Sakhalin. Let's keep going. In winter, the yurts are full of acrid smoke, which comes from the open fireplace. And on top of all this, the Gilyaks, their wives, and even the children smoke tobacco. Nothing is known about the morbidity and mortality of the Gilyaks, but one must form the conclusion that these unhealthy hygienic arrangements must inevitably have a bad effect on their health. Possibly it is to this they owe their small stature, the puffiness of their faces, and a certain sluggishness and laziness of movement. "The poor Gilyaks," Fuka-eri said. Writers give varying accounts of the Gilyaks' character, but all agree on one thing, that they are not a warlike race. They do not like quarrels or fights, and they get along peacefully with their neighbors. They have always treated the arrival of new people with suspicion, with apprehension about their future, but have met them every time amiably, without the slightest protest. And the worst thing they would do would be to tell lies at people's arrival, painting Sakhalin in gloomy colors and thinking by so doing to frighten foreigners away from the island. They embraced Krusenstern's traveling companions, and when Schrenk fell ill, this news quickly spread among the Gilyaks and aroused genuine sorrow. They tell lies only when trading or talking to a suspicious and, in their opinion, dangerous person. But before telling a lie, they exchange glances with each other in an utterly childlike manner. Every sort of lie and bragging in the sphere of everyday life and not in the line of business is repugnant to them. "The wonderful Gilyaks," Fuka-eri said. The Gilyaks conscientiously fulfill commissions they have undertaken, and there has not yet been a single case of a Gilyak abandoning mail halfway or embezzling other people's belongings. They are perky, intelligent, cheerful, and feel no standoffishness or uneasiness. whatever in the company of the rich and powerful. They do not recognize that anybody has power over them, and it seems they do not possess even the concept of senior and junior. People say and write that the Gilyaks do not respect family seniority either. A father does not think he is superior to his son, and a son does not look up to his father, but lives just as he wishes. An elderly mother has no greater power to a yurt than an adolescent girl. Bosniak writes that he chanced more than once to see a son striking his own mother and driving her out, and nobody daring to say a word to him. The male members of the family are equal amongst themselves. If you entertain them with vodka, then you also have to treat the very smallest of them to it as well. But the female members are all equal in their lack of rights, be it grandmother, mother, or baby girl still being nursed. They are ill-treated in the same way as domestic animals, like an object which can be thrown out, sold, or shoved with one's foot like a dog. However, the Gilyaks at least fondle their dogs, but their womenfolk never. Marriage is considered a mere trifle of less importance, for instance, than a drinking spree, and it is not surrounded by any kind of religious or superstitious ceremony. A Gilyak exchanges a spear, a boat, or a dog for a girl, takes her back to his own yurt, and lies with her on a bearskin. That is all there is to it. Polygamy is allowed, but it has not become widespread, although, to all appearances, there are more women than men. Contempt toward women, as if for a lower creature or object, reaches such an extreme in the Gilyak that in the field of the question of women's rights, he does not consider reprehensible even slavery in the literal and crude sense of the word. Evidently, with them, a woman represents the same sort of trading object as tobacco or nankeen. The Swedish writer Strindberg, a renowned misogynist, who desired that women should be merely slaves and should serve men's whims, is in essence of one and the same mind as the Gilyaks. If he ever chanced to come by to northern Sakhalin, they would spend ages embracing each other. Tango took a break at this point, but fuka-eri remained silent, offering no opinion on the reading. Tango continued. They have no courts, and they do not know the meaning of justice. How hard it is for them to understand us may be seen merely from the fact that up till the present day they still do not fully understand the purpose of roads. Even where a road has already been laid, they will still journey through the taiga. One often sees them, their families and their dogs, picking their way in Indian file across a quagmire right by the roadway. Fuka-eri had her eyes closed and was breathing very softly. Tango studied her face for a while, but could not tell whether she was sleeping or not. He decided to turn the page and keep reading. If she was sleeping, he wanted to give her as sound a sleep as possible, and he also felt like reading more Chekhov aloud. Formerly, the Naibuchi post stood at the river mouth. It was founded in 1866. Midsul found 18 buildings here, both dwellings and non-residential premises, plus a chapel and a shop for provisions. One correspondent who visited Naibuchi in 1871 wrote that there were 20 soldiers there under the command of a cadet officer. In one of the cabins he was entertained with fresh eggs and black bread by a tall and beautiful female soldier, who eulogized her life here and complained only that sugar was very expensive. Now, there are not even traces left of those cabins, and gazing round at the wilderness, the tall, beautiful female soldier seems like some kind of myth. They are building a new house here for overseers' officers and possibly a weather center, and that is all. The roaring sea is cold and colorless in appearance, and the tall grey waves pound upon the sand, as if wishing to say in despair, "O God, why did you create us?" This is the great, or as it is otherwise known, the Pacific Ocean. On this shore of the Naibuchi River, the convicts can be heard rapping away with axes on the building work, while on the other, far distant, imagined shore lies America. To the left, the capes of Sakhalin are visible in the mist, and in the right are more capes, while all around there is not a single living soul, not a bird, not a fly, and it is beyond comprehension who the waves are roaring for, who listens to them at night here, what they want, and finally, who they would roar for when I was gone. There on the shore one is overcome not by connected, logical thoughts, but by reflections and reveries. It is a sinister sensation, and yet at the very same time, you feel the desire to stand forever, looking at the monotonous movement of the waves and listening to their threatening roar. It appeared that fuka-eri was now sound asleep. He listened for her quiet breathing. He closed the book and set it on that little table by the bed. Then he stood up and turned the light off, taking one final look at fuka-eri. She was sleeping peacefully on her back, her mouth a tight, straight line. Tango closed the bedroom door and went back to the kitchen. It was impossible for him to continue with his own writing, though. His mind was now fully occupied by Chekhov's desolate Sakhalin coastal scenes. He could hear the sound of the waves. When he closed his eyes, Tango was standing alone on the shore of the Sea of Okhotsk, a prisoner of his own meditations, sharing in Chekhov's inconsolable melancholy. What Chekhov must have felt there at the end of the earth was an overwhelming sense of powerlessness. To be a Russian writer at the end of the 19th century must have meant bearing an inescapably bitter fate. The more they tried to flee from Russia, the more deeply Russia swallowed them. After rinsing his wineglass and brushing his teeth, Tango turned off the kitchen light, stretched out on the sofa, pulled a blanket over himself, and tried to sleep. The roar of the ocean still echoed in his ears, but eventually he began to lose consciousness and was drawn into a deep sleep. He awoke at 8:30 in the morning. There was no sign of fuka-eri in his bed. The pajamas he had lent her were balled up and tossed into the bathroom washing machine, the cuffs and legs still rolled up. He found a note on the kitchen table. "How are the Gilyaks doing now? I'm going home." Written in ballpoint pen on notepaper, the characters were small, square, and indefinably strange, like an aerial view of characters written on a beach in seashells. He folded the paper and put it in his desk drawer. If his girlfriend found something like this when she arrived at 11, she would make a terrible fuss. Tango straightened the bed and returned the fruits of Chekhov's labor to the bookcase. Then he made himself coffee and toast. While eating breakfast, he noticed that some kind of heavy object had settled itself in his chest. Some time had to go by before he figured out what it was. Fuka-eri's tranquil, sleeping face. Could I be in love with her? No, impossible, Tango told himself. It just so happens that something inside her has physically shaken my heart. So then, why am I so concerned about the pajamas she had on her body? Why did I almost unconsciously pick them up and smell them? There were too many questions. It was probably Chekhov who said that the novelist is not someone who answers questions, but someone who asks them. It was a memorable phrase, but Chekhov applied his attitude not only to his works, but to his life as well. His life presented many questions, but answered none. Although he knew quite well that he was suffering from an incurable lung disease, as a doctor he could not help but know. He tried hard to ignore the fact, and refused to believe he was dying until he was actually on his deathbed. He died young, violently, coughing up blood. Tango left the kitchen table, shaking his head. My girlfriend is coming today. I have to do laundry and clean the place up now. Thinking is something I can save for later. End of chapter.